As Lemieux showed, inner strength and will is just as important as raw talent in making it into the Hall of Fame. And so is intensity. Take Bobby Clark in the 1970s. He was a diabetic and didn't weigh more than 150 pounds sopping wet. But he never backed down on the ice, and by 1987 was a member of the Hockey Hall of Fame. No Hall of Famer was as intense as Maurice Richard, the Rocket, as he was known in the 1940s and 50s. Often played like a man possessed, but that intensity took Richard from the cold ice and landed him in hot water.
Maurice the Rocket Richard, a native son of Montreal, put on the number 9 of the Montreal Canadiens for the first time in 1942. He had blazing speed and was soon nicknamed the Rocket. But what set this Hall of Famer apart from his contemporaries was his unmatched intensity. The Rocket was fire on ice.
He'd get to that blue line and he'd start cutting for the net. You know, there was no skating around you or anything like that. I mean, he would skate right through you. He would go right for that net. That was his main purpose.
He wasn't satisfied until the red light went on. And the glare of the light, I guess, matched some of the glare in his eyes.
It was like a train coming at you at night, but it had, instead of one headlight, there were two.
And it was just amazing intensity blazing out of him, that if he looked hard at anything, like something out of Stephen King, it would have caught fire.
Maurice Richard had those moments, those nights, those games where he just took command, you know, with his force of will.
Early in his career with the Canadiens, it was clear Richard had a passionate desire to play that separated him from the crowd.
My dad was the first coach he had in the NHL. He came into the league in 42, 43. He got an early indication of the intensity of Maurice Richard. He came into the dressing room one night before a game, and my father said, "You're not playing tonight." And this young Maurice Richard slammed the door in my father's face and went home. Well, there was just a hush in the dressing room because kids didn't do this to a crusty old coach. And instead of being upset, my father turned to the players who were sitting there and said, "That's the kind of a player I want on my team."
Of course, Canadiens coach Dick Irvin was right, and Richard quickly became a team leader and one of the NHL's brightest stars, especially in 1945, when the Rocket established a new scoring standard, becoming the first player in league history to score 50 goals in 50 games. Even as Richard was setting individual records, his team always came first. He'd do anything to help his beloved Canadiens win. That iron intensity was most evident in Game 7 of the 1952 Stanley Cup semifinals against the Boston Bruins.
He was blindsided by a pretty tough player named Leo Levine, and he was flattened. He looked like he was dead.
So badly knocked around and concussed that they thought, well, he'll be through for the night.
And with about 3 minutes to go in the game, suddenly who appears on the Montreal bench walking out from the dressing room? Here's Maurice Richard.
With blood dripping from his face, and scored on the Boston goalie, and I don't think there's been a cheer heard like that in Montreal since.
The Canadiens lost to the Detroit Red Wings in the 1955 Stanley Cup Finals. But between 1956 and 1960, the team made its mark. Led by Richard, Montreal won a record 5 consecutive Stanley Cups. And all the while, the Rocket continued to score goals. He might have been getting older, but the fire within continued to burn bright as Richard set a scoring mark for generations to shoot at.
Early in the 1957-58 campaign, one of the world's finest athletes scores his 500th goal. The Rocket is undoubtedly a superstar.
His talent and desire, he set himself apart and just accomplished more in the playoffs, in the tough games, than anybody else, and that's why he's a Hall of Famer first and foremost.
Unfortunately, the same intense desire that drove the Rocket to become a scoring machine could also get him in trouble.
1955, Rocket Richard playing against the Boston Bruins. Hal Lako, his stick happened to cut Richard. Richard just wiped his hand across his head and saw the blood and went absolutely berserk and went after Hal Lako.
The linesman, Cliff Thompson, was a former Bruin. And the feeling was that while Thompson was holding the Rocket off, he wasn't holding off Hal Lako. So the Rocket did what was natural. Popped Cliff Thompson one.
Even in the outlaw days of the National Hockey League, the rambunctious Richard had gone too far. League President Clarence Campbell felt he had no choice but to suspend Richard for the remaining 3 games of the 1955 season, and then, incredibly, the playoffs.
It was a product of temper, but at the same time, it was an attack on the authority of the game and couldn't be dealt with in any other manner.
For Clarence Campbell to do what he did, which was to suspend Mr. Hockey, Maurice Richard, from the rest of the playoffs, to banish him from hockey, was an unbelievable act of courage.
He was trying to prove that he was the boss. He didn't take into account the many mitigating factors.
But because of those factors, Campbell's courage would ultimately turn to folly and have unexpected consequences, both at home in Montreal and far beyond. Stories from the Hall of Fame, hockey on the History Channel. In the spring of 1955, as Maurice Richard neared the end of his 13th NHL season with the Montreal Canadiens, he was suspended for striking a referee. But in suspending the Rocket, League President Clarence Campbell had severely miscalculated the reaction of the Montreal fans.
En 24 heures, le président Campbell était devenu une tête de turc et Richard une victime.
Campbell, however, would not back down and boldly attended the first game of Richard's suspension.
They pelted him with tomatoes. He had to hold his hand to his head to protect himself.
Campbell reçut d'abord une volée de coups et les policiers de faction ne réussirent pas à parer pour lui.
A tear gas bomb was let off. They had to close off the forum and evacuate the building. And then the vandals took over. They paraded around the building, throwing rocks and bricks. They went down St. Catherine Street, vandalizing cars, raiding hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage.
Richard's role in the 1955 hockey riots of Montreal, however large, didn't diminish his legend. And when the Rocket came up for the Hall of Fame in 1961, his worthiness was never in doubt.
The Rocket had to stand his ground, and stand his ground he did. Now, on the other side, Clarence Campbell, the president, he had to run the business, and run the business he did, and he did it in his hometown. That wasn't a black eye. It really signified how well both did their job.
Although controversy followed Richard, his accomplishments far outweighed his indiscretions. 544 career goals, 8 Stanley Cup championships, and a bond never to be broken between the spirited Richard and his Montreal fans that loved his intensity like no other.
Maurice Rocket